So now is a chance for us all to have a discussion about the topics we've discussed this morning. We'll call this security question time. We'll run it like the famous BBC show. So we've got some questions that have come from some stakeholders before the event. I think they remain relevant. If not, we'll obviously move on a bit quicker. So I'll ask the panel from our speakers this morning, and they're also joined by Alistair Booth from Lincolnshire Constabulary, who's a research student at Loughborough University. These guys will get an opportunity to put their thoughts forward, and then I'll open it to the floor if people want to make comments as well. Before we move to the pre-scripted questions, did anybody want to raise any questions from this morning's content with the speakers? Because now's the chance to do that, because I didn't give you that opportunity this morning. Simon? Actually,
good afternoon. Simon Whitehouse from SGW Consulting Group. I'd like to raise the question of landscape architecture within the built environment. We've been talking and hearing the speakers talk this morning about the use of pass-rated bollards, and certain speakers alluded to the fact that there is a significant aesthetic concern with a lot of planners in terms of bollards and steelwork and how that actually integrates into the streetscape. My question to the panel is, how do you actually believe that security professionals can widen the engagement process with landscape architects who actually use landscape features such as ha-ha walls, changes of grade, water features to actually create HVM and counter-terrorism measures by design?
Yes, so I could say, I think as I've alluded to in the presentation, we have our coordinating body, the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, and we are closely aligned to the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure. And I think there is a vast amount of corporate stakeholder engagement that is ongoing at that central level, and also through that research and development that's being conducted more through through the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure. Actually, those conversations and communications are ongoing. I think this is actually about the fact that we are very cognizant of the practical issues that are presented by some of the vehicle security barriers that have been available on the market, and like trying to move that innovation forward to come up with much more amenable solutions. That we've got that increase in toolkits in terms of those vehicle security measures, and that we aren't just talking the bollard situation. So there is much work that is ongoing, driven from our central agencies, very much engaged through the private industry in order to progress that. Does that answer your question from my perspective?
Yes, it does partly answer the question. I think the challenge is how do we actually also get REBA and members of REBA, and particularly within the landscape sector, to actually join the security community and actually identify that component as an integral piece within security planning, so that police, government, developers, security consultants and governing bodies are actually encouraging people that at the moment are sitting on the periphery, that are potentially not actually seeing their involvement as an integrated component, to actually come together to alleviate some of the problems.
I think something that's quite telling is actually the Westminster situation. If those temporary measures that were put out there years ago and are now being reinforced further following the recent attack, we've not seen industry and the police able to find a solution that fits the historical environment around the Palace of Westminster. And I think there are definitely solutions out there, and I think maybe the government need to have a project that champions what's possible and get some kind of panel formed, solve the problem there at Westminster, and it gives an example to everybody else. But I don't understand how for so long those temporary measures have remained in place, and they're pretty hideous, ultimately, as we've seen on the slides earlier.
If I can just pick that up, because I think there is a lot of guidance out there, not necessarily detailed guidance, that talks about the sorts of solutions that you're talking about slopes and trees and ponds and green spaces generally being used as HVM type measures. Now I think, and your point, Gavin, is, well, where are the examples of where that's actually been done? So in the work that I've done over the last 10 years, I hear stories from CTSAs, and they say, oh yeah, so an unnamed sports stadium in the north of England were thinking about HVM, and the CTSA had persuaded them that trees were a really good option. The owners went, absolutely not, because it spoils the beauty of my stadium. So there are some real challenges to actually doing anything other than what is a default solution, which is the sort of bollards and barriers solution. And we need examples that we can draw on of where good landscaping has been used, because apparently it has been used in a number of places, and I actually don't know where those are. Nobody seems to know. It goes to Paul's point that he was making about best practices, or good practices, whatever you want to call them, about actually how do people that need to find out what the breadth of experiences are in this space, how do they find out about that? Because certainly the work that I've done, and I was working with NATSO and CPNI, and they were telling me, do not ever tell anybody about the work that you do for us. Don't give examples, not even the ones that are in the public realm. So I put up a slide of the Arsenal football ground and the sort of artistic approach to HVM, and they were saying, no, don't show that, because you're reinforcing that place is at risk. Yeah, I know they do. No, but that was my advice to the media, because media are always contacting you saying, they say, don't give examples. So, well, you know, it's a very difficult thing to do, and I think the landscape thing falls into that sort of categories. We just don't have those tangible examples that we can look at. Now, I think in the next couple of years, we will start seeing those coming online, because there's all sorts of debates not necessarily in the UK, but in other countries, Italy in particular, about where they're now looking at more landscape type approaches to security rather than sticking concrete blocks everywhere.
Just jumping on what John said there, I think the circle's starting to turn a little bit, to be honest. We're starting to turn. And I think they are starting to look at trying to get that information out to people. I mean, there was a project not so long ago run by the Home Office where they're asking businesses, you know, what sort of things they want to know information-wise to try and deal with the threats that they're facing. So they are starting to ask people. There is some guidance out there, in particular, CP and I have got a couple of booklets out. The last one I think was 2013, 2014. There were examples of certain things that could be considered, particularly around HVM, you know, new defensible space types of thing. But really, they're looking more at the potential solutions as opposed to looking at specific case studies. And I think, like I say, in the next couple of years, I think you'll see more examples starting to come out. But it's going to be balancing it with the sensitivity around sites, because they'll be revealing what protective security measures certain sites have got. So yeah, it's that sort of trade-off, really, that balance. But I think in the next couple of years, I think we'll see that starting to move along a little bit, to be honest.
Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, I think if we're honest about it, probably most of our kind of professional bodies are on the periphery of this, perhaps outside London, and it usually takes a catalyst of something. And I think today, and BRE, and having pulled all of this together and pulled people together, ought to be something that we all take from here and prompt those discussions. I think I'd ask the question of kind of landscape architect bodies and the like, where are they in terms of producing their best practice and that desire and willingness to get involved in this and put their hands up and say, actually, look what we can do and we can bring to the table as part of that solution. It's going to have to be all of the creativity and intelligence in the kind of wider placemaking and managing of places that's going to have a chance at getting this right. My thing would be actually today NBRE is as good a catalyst as I've been aware of to actually start and prompt those discussions and get the right people to be involved in it.
I do think, going back to what Gavin said, I do think it needs to be at the highest level as well, because there are challenges that are faced in different sectors. You say about the Palace of Westminster, for example, you know, you've got obviously other bodies as well, like English Heritage, or now banded as Historic England, you know, because they're against certain things around security. If it's going to change the fabric of the building, that's causing issues as well, because you're not going to get a CCTV camera that's 300 years old that you can put up in a church, for example. So there's all sorts of things to balance with that, but I think it's got to start at the highest level you know, with people that are in charge and sort of shaping the direction for these national bodies to get together to discuss the way forward. It's got to be coherent across the board, I would suggest.
Mark, did you want to put a quick...
No, well, absolutely. I think that, you know, we talked a little bit earlier about proportionality and who decides what's appropriate, and I think this is a great example where planners and planning conditions for specific buildings and local plans have to deal with a lot of different issues, and I'm sure the security consultants in the room have all worked on a project where you're obliged to protect against vehicle impact, but you're obliged not to put anything in the street scene in a separate paragraph of the planning documents, and there are competing priorities there, and I guess, you know, those are examples of where I've leaned on the authority of the CTSA to help us get something through, but what there isn't is clear guidance on what should take priority. I think.
Great. Stuart, you want to just on the front here? Okay.
We see a lot of developers wanting a lot of these measures put on the public highway. I was just wondering, what as planners can we do to encourage developers more to consider it at early stages? We know they should be doing it.
I think it's interesting that you say they want to put it on the public highway. I agree that you know, there's been quite a bit of press recently about privately owned public spaces and the pros and cons of that kind of thing. And it might be my London-centric experience, but I've never seen a developer who was unwilling to protect their privately owned public space, and that's one of the things that I think goes in favour of those kind of privately owned squares and what have you, where the developer will usually spring for the measures to protect, and especially in the last few months since recent events have indicated the prevalence of vehicle-borne attacks. So how we encourage them to get those measures out of the streetscape, I think, is a big challenge. I think encouraging them to design them more sympathetically and to use benches and planters and the things that we've alluded to earlier is easier. Getting them out of the streetscape entirely, I think, is going to be a challenge.
The problem I think we have in central London is they want to maximise their full space potential, of course, so that's building right out to the building line. I don't think I'd be able to say cut the building back.
Yeah, absolutely, and I can probably think of two where we've successfully built hostile vehicle mitigation into the actual building line itself, but it tends to be significantly more expensive. So again, who decides what the priority is my question back, I guess.
I think I'm also sitting and I think we've got probably more examples than that of where we have got mitigation within the design, because it's something that people have got their heads around. It's not something we have to mention anymore because it's inevitable. We've got our policies for the mitigation to be in the structure, but obviously we don't have any stand-off in the City of London, so we've only got that problem, and we don't particularly want it on the highway either, so that sets a whole set of problems. But I think in our realm, it's not a new issue, and developers do think about it ahead. So we're a little bit ahead of the game, I think, in that sense.
No, I would tend to agree, and I think that, you know, the city or the corporation's local plan is one of the few that I can think of that distinctly and specifically mentions counter-terrorism, and maybe we need to see a little bit more of that in boroughs across London.
Well, can I just ask a quick question? It's good to have the City of London here. If you were conducting public realm enhancements, would you consider yourselves having a strategy for protecting privately owned land by providing HVM on public space? Is that something you consider if developers were willing to support that plan by providing funds? Is that something you do as a collective security basis? Or?
We do work very closely with the City Police. And actually, there's someone else here who could answer this question better than me.
He's just run out the back door.
But yes, we do. We do work very closely in terms of, and we are looking at obviously measures on our land, but obviously private land is a different matter.
I think this falls into one of the usual kind of planning challenges, which is about what we call it the red line, but it's the application side, it's what's owned, and how to push an owner's interest beyond what is kind of their very obvious self-interest. It's about a whole place approach, isn't it? That only has the chance of trying to deal with that. And various of the speakers have said, actually, you could invest similar amounts of money, and you protect kind of a quarter of a city from a decent-sized development if you do it in the right way. But it takes somebody, and currently it hasn't consistently been councils that have pulled all of that together. And I think it is that place leadership role of actually recognising, okay, somebody's got to start to pull this all together and pull everybody together to produce the kind of strategy that says, okay, you might not have to do your own building and spend that money, but here is the whole place approach that protects that site in itself. Getting over that's the challenge, though, isn't it?
In a previous role, I was based at the Urban Planning Council in Abu Dhabi, and in that environment, the approach had always been development was done at a plot level, and they'd never defined planning application boundaries in that red line. And actually, security was a driver for changing that entire approach to development, because you had fractured public realms. Pavement grades would change literally, so you couldn't get around Abu Dhabi in a wheelchair, for example, because literally one developer would build to one level and the next one next door wouldn't integrate at all. It's kind of crazy to think about that, but that's how advanced our planning system is. It deals with issues like that. So we've got a much better starting point. But yeah, dealing with that issue of public-private space and so on is absolutely critical to getting the right solutions in the right place, basically.
So I'm a missing colleague. So I'm from the City of London. Just say thank you for doing the very first presentation, actually picking up on Ring Steel, which was say Ring Steel, shouldn't say it, but traffic environmental zone. It's been a journey for us, because that was the first real attempt that we had to try and deal with issues around counter-terrorism in a coordinated way. It had an awful lot of benefits around traffic and environment. That was the main reason that we hung on that to get it through members. It then morphed into what is a very well-developed planning policy around counter-terrorism protection of buildings. And the example of the question around where there's good examples of best practice, we have fantastic examples in Square Mile at the moment of the difference in extremes between certain developers whose culture of the organisation is to say, we want to say this building is protected. We want it overt, we want it on the highway, we want it so that anybody who drives and walks past it knows that our building is protected. And they're very happy to shout about it and come onto any presentation and say, this is how we're protected, and it's $250. We've got other organisations who take the complete opposite angle and want everything integrated into the street scene, and you might have bollards on the fingers of one hand. And they're the last people, though, who want to say, here's an example of best practice about entry in, because their whole culture is around not affecting the public, doing things in a very covert way, I can put it that. So we've got these great examples, and unfortunately we can't shout about the ones that we really do want to shout about. But where we're moving, it was traffic and environmental zone, protecting buildings was the thing, so from traffic to buildings, and now because of the change in threat, it's about protecting people. So where we're trying to now address is the Westminster example. We have crowded spaces that no one has been responsible for, if I can put it that way, up until now, and that has to fall, we think, onto the Highway Authority. So we're going to have to try and look at those sorts of measures, and that's where we are looking at what resource we have to pay for those things, because it's difficult outside of the rules of SIL and 278 and 106 and everything else to try and create a packet of income to enable us to pay for those sorts of costs, which is why I suspect we'll see the stuff on London's bridges for quite some time. We all know that they're not going to go away, but who's actually going to pay to take off the temporary stuff from the Met Police and put on something permanent?
Just pick up on, I guess I'm throwing a question back to our City of London colleagues. So in the first Crowded Places guidance that came out, I think in 2010, the city was used as an example of a potential area-based approach of doing this. In other words, not just at an individual site level, but a number of sites, almost like a business improvement district maxed out for security. And from what you're saying, it doesn't appear to be that that's actually occurring in practice.
It's times changed, unfortunately.
Right.
There was a momentum at that point.
Right.
And I think there were a number of schemes that were considered, were consulted on, were more than just things, ideas on a sheet of paper. And then momentum from various sources actually died away from that. And that's an unfortunate position given where we all are now. I think there's very much a focus on current threat, not necessarily potential threat.
Right.
And that led to some difficult decisions, particularly around the price tags for those sorts of things. Again, that comes back to resources. And so, whereas we've been looking at questions of proportionality, it's now about public acceptance, and we still don't quite know. The public wants something to be done, that comes to phrase. But then when you say, but do you want it to be a fortress city? The answer is no. Somewhere in between, we have a happy medium. At the moment, we don't quite know where that is, and we'll only know by sucking it and seeing it, I think.
Yeah. Of course, this was the experience of the ring of steel or ring of plastic in first instance, because they put it in, then everybody complained that it was there, wanted it removed, and then you got another bomb, and they finally accepted it. It should stay at that point.
Do we have any other questions on this one? My goodness. Right, gentleman at the back corner.
Mark Chappell, member of the Security Institute. And it's another question about what used to happen we forgot about. 2004, the Civil Contingencies Act was enacted by Parliament, it's law, and local authorities are obligated to produce a risk register which flows down from the Cabinet Office's National Risk Register, which only came out a few weeks ago. The question for each of the panel is, do you routinely use the local authorities' risk register to do your work? And then the second part of the question is, should you?
Simple answer for me is no. It very rarely comes up. It's usually a project-specific risk assessment. It's never been presented in that fashion. I'm obviously aware of it, but it's never been presented in that fashion as something to be considered in the specific design of a building, in my experience. Feel free to consult the rest of my colleagues in the room and see if they have any different experiences there.
From a local authority then, I suppose that's the proper real challenge, isn't it? In the current work, our kind of revamped focus on this and the group that we've pulled together, yes, there's been thinking in reference to that. In terms of day-to-day decision-making, no. And in terms of that sharing within, kind of, I suppose, my area in planning, I'll put my hand up and say no.
I think probably I'm going to echo the responses from my other colleagues. Obviously, in terms of our vulnerability assessments, we are vulnerability focused, impact driven and risk assessed, and very much particularly from that counter-terrorism threat picture. Now, whilst we do try and take into account other risks to ensure that the two correlate, we can't always achieve that, and I think probably the answer is routinely no, we do not.
Part of the problem might be because the National Risk Register is classified. It simply doesn't get down in that.
No, there's an open source version published last month, 2 months ago.
Yeah, so I mean, for years it didn't include security risks, and now it apparently does. I'm ashamed to say I've not looked at the latest one, and I wouldn't use it in my work anyway. But I would say about, I think risk assessment is really interesting, and I'll tell a story from 10 years ago when the Crowded Places document was coming out, and this is when NATSO sent all the CTSAs to all the crowded places in the country to say which ones are at risk. And thousands and thousands and thousands came back at risk, because nobody would say that a place was not at risk in case it, for some reason, got attacked and then somebody's dropped one, essentially. So there was this risk averseness to saying, to prioritising what our major risks are. So I think we can use these sorts of registers are useful, but I think they're only useful in the way in which we think about prioritising where we do action.
Right, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to jump into the first pre-scripted question, which I think follows exactly in line with what we've just been discussing. So this is, what types of development are high risk? That term is used in the National Planning Policy Framework, but is undefined and warrant closer scrutiny. So the importance of this question is, if you're a developer, you want to know if you're developing a high-risk site, if you have to do something different about the way you approach the planning process. If you're building next to a high-risk site, it would probably be helpful to know that, because obviously it might impact what you have to do on your site and so on. And if you have a cluster of high-risk sites, there may be an opportunity to have an improvement district, collective security arrangements and so on. So there's one question. And the second bit is, can security risk justify alternative planning requirements for these kinds of developments? So should we have different pre-application consultation process, validation requirements, and so on? So I'm going to throw this to Paul, because you're our chief planner, so I'll start off with you.
I'm not sure I can answer what types of developments are high risk, to be honest. I think it's, I mean, the changeable nature, or as much as I can see of it, of where the threat is coming from, makes this a continuously movable area, movable feast as to how we respond to that. My organisation, like probably most, getting from what my politicians might think or say is a priority and where to work, down to people who are actually doing the work and that kind of day-to-day, is a challenge with the most obvious of things to take into consideration. Somewhere that doesn't seem to have the obvious source of that definition and is continuously moving and is almost, and to be honest, only relatively recently come into such sharp focus. We're at the point now of thinking through those things. Can planning requirements, different planning requirements? Yes, and the hooks are there in the NPPF. Now, the NPPF is a great document for drawing from, and it can say most things to most people. But in this context, it can say, if we have defined and agreed that there's a high-risk location or a high-risk development, then the NPPF gives us enough teeth. Whether we brought that through into local plan policy or not, the NPPF provides the ability to argue that. Ultimately, whether we're fighting across an appeal table and the like, you would hope that this is something so serious that actually, nobody's going to take it to that sort of extreme.
Jenny, I'll throw this to you, obviously, because you're representing the police. Just a quick question. Are you in a position, as you're not a statutory consultee in the planning process, how would you know if a development was being created that might be high risk? Or do you have a list of existing sites you regard as high risk, and do you consult with your local equivalents of Paul there?
So it's a bit of a mix of everything, and certainly from a counter-terrorism security advisor perspective and those core work streams that we work to, some of those sites are already in existence and predicated by national communications and lists that are shared with us, and we take on that responsibility in terms of protecting those locations. As I've said through that presentation, there are also occasions where, because of that change in business and because of legislation that is in place, that site then becomes a site of interest to us from a counter-terrorism security advisor perspective. I think with regards to the crowded places piece, and this is where the challenge lies, obviously when we look at that current threat picture and that complexity in terms of the threat picture, the sites that we are looking at do have that ability to change, but we do have to have some form of model in place to be able to perform that judgment in terms of the risk assessment process. And this is where we will look at factors to say, actually, in terms of attractiveness. So, and included within that will be, actually, what does that security posture already look like for that environment, that location? Again, going back to those, the philosophy of protective security. But also, we will be looking at in terms of its recognisability, its iconicity, it's whether we have notable users at that location. So again, if we're routinely seeing a particular societal group actually making use of those premises. So we do have to have some model in place, but we do also have to have that flexibility to know that list has to be translated, and maybe we do have to have those routine reviews to bring on board new sites. So we have got lists in place, but then also this is about, as I said, the relationships that we maintain and an understanding of our role as counter-terrorism security advisors that we have with architectural liaison officers, as the representatives, as the sort of statutory consultees from the police, where they will be bringing planning applications to our attention. And again, it is down to some of that ongoing relationship that we develop with the local authority and planning teams as well.
So, I mean, I think there's one question, and I guess to echo some of Mark's earlier comments, the question for me in that question is obviously it's changeable, but who defines what high risk is? Is it the planner? Is it the developer? Is it the CTSA? So, I mean, the one tool that I would recommend, given that I guess the tool that you use at NATSO and CTSAs isn't publicly available, is the Australian Crowded Places Guidance has a self-assessment tool. Where that can be done by anybody. It's freely available, and that to me seems to be a way, you know, you are apportioning your own risk, and therefore you make your decisions based on what you're going to do on the basis of that. Would seem, I mean, it's all about likelihood and impact, as all risk assessments tend to be. So, but it's pretty simple to fill in by the looks of it.
Sorry, is that like VSAT that used to happen? Obviously,
it's a refined version of that. I think it's much more user friendly than that.
Does anybody in the audience have a view on this?
So, Peter Lavery, member of the Security Institute. I mean, types of developments, crowded places between iconic targets. City of London's been referenced already. I can think of 2 or 3 crowded places in the City of London that are literally jam-packed between iconic targets. So clearly they're going to be high risk. And in those circumstances, they would, in my view, justify alternative planning arrangements around them, especially around HVM, etc., etc. But that's, you know, the City of London is a very sort of unique location. But yeah. You can have those for lots of others you talked about earlier on. The cricket at Trent Bridge, and so on and so forth, these are all potential iconic crowded places and targets for certain events, etc. So, you know, it's something we need to move forward on. Step change and CT, and the fact that the national guidance is up for review, you know, and the feedback from here and everything that's been filmed and I'm sure should be digested. It's the ideal opportunity to update that guidance, bring CT into it more forcefully, and look to step change and the CTUs to provide the guidance that can be put into that document that local authorities can use in anger.
I mean, if I can just respond to your question, I think you gave some very good examples of high-risk targets, but also places around high-risk targets that have to do stuff. The question is, who pays for that? So just because I happen to locate my building next to the US Embassy, does that mean that I pay for that security?
You owe a duty of care to those people that come to that.
Yeah,
location.
Of course. No, and I understand that. It's more of a sort of bigger sort of ethical, moral question about should they be paying because they're actually the risk. So
you're the landowner.
Yeah.
If it's your crowded place, if it's your shopping centre that you position beside a target of opportunity, then it's down to you. Duty of care to the public.
No.
I think the interesting one then becomes when someone who is a high risk moves next door to you, you already own your land, and do you have to sell up or pay for it? But yes, it's a complicated issue, I guess.
Yeah, quite.
Yeah. Actually, leads on nicely to the question I wanted to ask. My name's John Stratton from Transport for London, Primary Action and Operational Security. I was going to ask for the panel's perspective on the Home Office's user pays principle, and whether or not you think that's fit for purpose, or whether you might think it's a recipe for inconsistency.
I don't know a great deal about that one, if I'm perfectly honest. I mean, my view around the funding side of it, I think there should be more incentives for counter-terrorism measures. So, for example, I mean, they've had things like the pool reinsurance. You know, I think that there should be more incentive for businesses to really, you know, to sort of encourage them to invest in security. And at the moment, for me, I'm yet to really see anything substantial that encourages businesses, you know, to make them want to invest in the hostile vehicle mitigation or things that reduce blast and ballistic threats, that sort of stuff. Whether or not that's through an insurance scheme, you know, the pool re, I don't know. I've not really heard a great deal, to be honest, about you know, some of the benefits, and I'm led to believe there is sort of strict criteria around that as to how people can get reductions in their insurance and things. Yeah, but I think really they need to look at it to have some incentives really, because you know a lot of companies do view security and investment that security is dead money. You know, I know we've spoken about duty of care to people, but there is nothing there, you know, that says to businesses that you're going to invest in the security, apart from protecting your assets and your users, that it's going to generate any income. And really, a lot of businesses do look at that. So I think really one area that could be looked at is to see where there is more sort of ways that we could sort of, you know, incentivise it really and make it more attractive for businesses to invest in that sort of security, is what I think. And I think if there was those measures there, or that mechanism there, then you may get more of an interest and an uptake on it.
I think that's right, how radical to be here. If it's just on the basis of a user pays, I mean, from my experience of operating Section 106, which is about impacts of a particular development, if that's what we rely on to address this problem, then we're going to fail at it. And I think this is that challenge of whole place. And what is the mechanism that actually achieves addressing that? And I suppose I've started kind of thinking as listening to people today about, okay, City of London, great work. Has that changed the focus of where the likely next incident happens and pushed it somewhere else? And if we start to follow that through in a logical consequence, if it is kind of almost each developer, each private bit of land looks after itself, it slowly narrows down to focus where the next incident is likely to be, which is, and I think it really opens up that question of where is the public and where is the state in addressing this, coordinating it, and ultimately it comes from all of our own pockets. But if it is just a basis of a private money, whatever mechanism it might be, solves this, and you do it on a case-by-case basis, development-by-development basis, then it simply isn't going to cut the mustard.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to reflect on two things. I mean, one, Gavin will be able to talk about this more than me, the developer pays principle that you have in Abu Dhabi, and really just reflect on the insurance thing. I mean, this was something that the City of London lobbied for in 1992 when Paul Ree was set up, was actually trying to get a significant discount for the Ring of Steel, of course, and they were unable to do that because the insurance industry have absolutely no incentive to do it. And so they won't, and other than the odd Lloyd's syndicate, nobody's going to get insurance for counter-terrorism. So that's just the way the market rocks. And I think, you know, your Sabre thing, and that's obviously one of the pitches that you have, and I think that's a challenge, unless you can link it to other benefits that you can get that make that business case more robust.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on it. There are businesses that will do this because they recognise their duty of care and so on, and that it's good value for them in terms of the happiness of their employees, the well-being and so on. There are businesses that will need that stick, a strong regulatory requirement to actually deliver on any of this, and it is very much a sliding spectrum. So did the developer pays policy, which still is in place, which I wrote, so I have to be careful what I say, did it work? To some extent, it helps when the state is behind a lot of government-owned companies. It's very easy to get money in locations like that. It's very different here, where most of the assets we're talking about are truly privately owned, and ultimately shareholders are paying and coughing up for this. If you can't show a true reduction in risk or benefit to the business, it's hard to get those measures implemented. I think something that really has to be clarified is the national interest versus the owner's interest. You know, I think any businessman would say, if my operations could be adversely affected by a security incident, of course I'm going to take measures to protect myself. There may not be bollards in the street, it may be an insurance policy, it may be sharing information with people. Whatever strategy I use, I will adopt that. The second I get asked to protect the state, then I start to have problems spending my money doing that, because that's a national issue. And I don't think that clarity is there from the police, CP&I and so on, because those are two very different. The whole issue of risk ownership hasn't been addressed. Funny enough, there is a reluctance for private business to pay for the protection of the national infrastructure. No surprise. We should be protecting our own national infrastructure as a state, and the taxpayer pays. That's my view anyway. But I would like to move on, if I can, to another question, which is, I think, directly related. we're talking about the private sector paying, but ultimately the public sector, in the form of local authorities, transport providers, are building assets which are crowded places, are national infrastructure, and should they be showcasing best practice? We've talked about the need to have good examples of how this can be done well, and the question here is, should they, when they're making capital investments, such as large kind of public realm improvements in kind of different kind of town centres and so on, should they be paying up and protecting private space? Any thoughts? Paul?
Protecting private space. I suppose what would the response of the political leadership be at the City Council? It has the role of keeping all of its citizens safe. It's fair to say, in the decision making that we have and the processes in place, it's not overt currently, and given some of the seriously straitened financial conditions we're in, the costs of almost best practice, or even good practice, or even some practice, is actually really difficult to deliver. So at this moment in time, we ought to. I don't think we've got an obligation to do it. It translates differently in each place, and it's the context of simply no money in local government and within local authorities. So even kind of some of our riskier locations, it's a struggle to deliver good practice within that.
Sorry, I'm reading the question, but I think both the public and private do have an obligation to share best practice. I think it was Nick from Canary Wharf earlier on that sort of showed that in relation to the threat, he moved some non-PAS 68 plants around, obviously, that was pushed out there, that was something they did independently. That went around as best practice. Lots of other corporates and other defensible spaces looked at that as quick wins of dropping planters 1.5 tons to, it may not stop something, but it will put something in the mind of someone attacking. To his point, I think also around avoiding a temporary traffic sign on the bridge. That you've got to showcase that best practice and let others see that, because some small, medium enterprises don't have the expertise to have this around. So where we do see that expertise and that best practice, it should be shared for others to benefit from. And that's to a point that actually was discussed at Step Change in the Guildhall in the summer.
I think it's the reality of, we have lots of obligations on and that kind of place leader role. Yes, we should do. And then there's the real world. And I would love to be able to have had a whole load of different slides this morning of saying what we've done, and actually trying to get over that sensitivity of sharing, best practice and good practice. But all of this stuff costs money ultimately to do it. So I agree with the sentiment of that, but I and others, we operate in the context of some practice being sort of where we are kind of almost aspiring to because of the financial position that we're in.
Just to I'll close this out because I want to move on, but in our survey, which I said some of the results are in your delegate packs today, when we asked the question of who do you hold responsible for your security where you live, our respondents said, and this was equally, the local authority and the police, and they were the two kind of top two answers that we got back from people. So there's a perception that you are spending money to protect them around where they live. And obviously we asked the question then around where they work and so on. So you can have a look at those results at a later time.
I think if you're talking about where people live, though, Gavin, there's an interesting truism that's usually mentioned by police, design and crime officers, which is that the social and affordable housing in large prime residential developments is often better protected than the expensive apartments, because secured by design, or PAS 24 before ADQ came in, is conditioned, or is a condition of the affordable operator taking on that development. So in a way, that is the local authority showcasing best practice for residential security, and it makes no difference to whether the rest of the apartments get it or not.
Great. Okay, let's move away from money, because that could go on forever. So we're talking about planning. So here's a question about capacity building. So do planners need to be offered training and support so they can recognise good design, which address protective security alongside other planning objectives? So this is all about building that kind of resource in local authorities. John, I know you'll be
Yeah, I'll pick this one up to start with, and I'd paraphrase or slightly change your question. I don't think it's just planners. I think this is CTSAs, I think this is security consultants, all need training, and even if that is just working together. So my own experience is I've done a bunch of training at NATSO for CTSAs. I developed the Argos Professional program with NATSO to do exactly this. And what came through from me doing that training was that CTSAs largely, at that point, it's a few years ago now, had no idea about planning and design. They're not from that background. So, you know, actually getting them up to speed with what planners do at a very simple level is the first step, and then the sorts of considerations that planners working. Equally, planners, where I've taught, and I've taught at university planning courses for over 20 years, they have zero idea about security. Absolutely zero, and they don't get that in any undergraduate course that you can mention, or postgraduate course in the UK at the moment, with the exception of the ones that I used to teach in, because they just don't get it. But when they do get it, they think it's really interesting, and they're really engaged by that. So I think everybody needs training in this space, and that training is about learning. We call it in sort of in academic speak sort of transdisciplinarity. So it's about planners knowing about how security people think, knowing about how police think, and they all should know about each other's roles so that they can work more effectively together.
Can I just throw that to Rick from the Security Institute's perspective? I think that's a really interesting point there. Perhaps, as you represent the security industry, maybe that's something that we can offer in going out to universities in other disciplines like public realm design, landscaping and architecture, and actually presenting the security industry's kind of requirements, let's call it.
I must admit, I wasn't entirely focused on what you said.
Right.
Based on what you said.
Tut-tut.
We are always pushing across any academic establishment, whether it be a university, or independent trainers, that there should be a depth of variety of training courses, and absolutely this should be one of those. People like Mark didn't, put out thin air. They've done courses to get to where they are. So there needs to be more emphasis on it, but it's got to be within the wider context of all other courses. And I've spoken to people today that are on. I mean,
just to add to what I previously said, so 10, 12 years ago, the Royal Town Planning Institute put round an audit or an edict to all planning departments in the country to say you must teach climate change adaptation and you must engage in this throughout your curriculum. Now, it would be relatively simple for them to issue a similar type of edict, and they've done the same thing around health as well. There's sort of a similar edict around safety and security type of measures. And the other thing I should have mentioned was the one occasion when CTSAs went into a university and tried to deliver Argos Professional for planners at the University of West of England 10 years ago. There was a protest by the student union about them doing it. So, there's a lot of things that mitigate against them doing it, and I don't think those CTSAs would have gone back to that institute. Anyway.
I was going to say, I think to the police one, I expect that there will be an answer there, because I remember doing my Home Office crime prevention course, and there were architectural liaison officers courses, and those were the principal people who were first chosen, one from every county, to be a CTSA. So we may have lost some of that, but we used to have ALOs as CTSAs back in the beginning. So maybe we've lost that, but I'm sure the police have still got that capability.
And I think to be perfectly honest with you, in terms of that CTSA, the skill set of the CTSAs, you have members that come from very different backgrounds, some of which do come from that architectural liaison officer background, some come from the private industry that also have that awareness, a fuller awareness in terms of planning and design and architecture. And I think a lot of that is something that for individuals that don't come from that background, it is through that day-to-day engagement with various partners where that understanding is developed. Do we have something formalised in terms of that? No, we don't. But that is about the making good use of our neighbouring regions, making use of our peers within the region to gain that requisite knowledge. I think in terms of actually the awareness of planners, again, I mean, as alluded to, we do make those efforts at various opportunities to raise that awareness and enter into that dialogue around protective security. But I think, as John said, we have come across some significant challenges when it has been a case of actually delivering those events, and maybe in the current climate that may well be different now, but certainly historically the appetite in and around talking around counter-terrorism and protective security wasn't necessarily there, and in some realms was seen quite negatively. So I think that is something as well from a CT Associate we are really driving forward and trying to improve that awareness delivery that we can. But as I say, in terms of some of the regional work that we're doing, understanding that we do need to get that messaging out to key individuals like chief executives, like heads of planning departments, and actually running seminars that with subject matter experts that can articulate that to a great degree.
I think the question probably is running before we can walk. And I think, as John said, the focus is it's got to be about a cross-sector awareness raising. That question almost takes it to, and therefore planners should know about this and be the kind of arbiters of solving the whole problem. I think you've got to push back on that and say, unless this is done collectively, we've not got an awful lot of chance on it.
Okay, sorry Simon, I'm just going to move on to this question. One of the things that was discussed in the planning of this event with NACTSO and DCLG was the role of the private sector. So we've heard and we've seen in the National Planning Policy Framework document, it talks about the need to speak to local security advisors. It doesn't really mention the private security sector and security consultants, and this is obviously why we invited Mark here today to talk about what security consultants typically do on projects. One of the barriers we get told about by private developers is that they're offered free consultancy by CTSAs. So why would they ever employ a private sector security consultant? Because they cost money. And they want to be involved for a long time in the project, not only to advise on the threat and risk, but to actually deliver solutions. Now, obviously, from my point of view, I would think that was a welcome thing, because you don't just get the advice, you actually get delivery and implementation. Have people got thoughts on the potential role, expanded role of the private sector, and how this could maximise the resources available to deal with the increasing tempo of terrorist attacks that Jenny's talked about earlier? Mark?
Well, I'm never going to say no, am I, mate? I think there are three reasons normally in my experience that any type of third-party consultant is employed on any type of project. If we put aside the fact that you might want to employ somebody who's got independent insurance, that leaves us with capacity and capability. And security design for the built environment wouldn't be the only place in the built environment process where there either isn't the public sector capacity because of funding cuts, or there isn't the detailed engineering capability to deliver on the recommendations that come out from central government. So I think there's a strong place, certainly in detailed engineering. I think I mentioned earlier where if the outcome of discussions with the CTSA is a certain level of blast protection or hostile vehicle mitigation, then somebody needs to do the detailed engineering as part of the design team, and it might be the structural engineer can carry that, or the facade engineer can carry that, or it might be that you need a specialist, and the same across the various different subsectors of security.
Anybody else there? Jenny?
I mean, actually, to be honest, I would echo the comments that Mark's made. I think certainly, as I alluded to, in the current climate, we have seen an increase in demand in terms of the counter-terrorism security advisors service, and we do still have to maintain that we are focused on our core work streams, and within those core work streams that we are, like I say, taking that threat-informed, vulnerability and impact-driven focus. So whilst, yes, we would love to be able to address all of the sites that fall underneath the Crowded Places banner, simply the capacity isn't there. I think as well, in terms of the point made around some of that more technical advice, we are impartial in the advice that we give as counter-terrorism security advisors. We, in addition to the recommendations and requirements, we are in that position to be able to provide that more substantial information behind it, but certainly there are limitations to that ability, and certainly when we are moving into the realms of much more technical specifications, we need to actually harness the experts in that field. So,
and in terms of your experience of working on projects where there is a security consultant or where there isn't, has that relationship been complementary? Has it been conflicting? How have you found that?
I think generally we have seen it working in a complementary in a complementary way. Certainly through having that open and honest dialogue. Actually, the discussion, and as I said, it's actually about considering the various options that are practical, achievable, affordable, sustainable. All of those requirements that also meet the other requirements of a site itself. So I have seen that liaison with security consultancy very good, and actually that sharing of the best practice, as we've seen when we have come across a challenge with Site A, and actually we have been able to link in with our security consultants that we know are already engaged with another project to share that learning and the best practice and be able to offer additional solutions to other sites that we're engaged with.
I'm going to move on to the last, sorry, question.
Very, very quickly on that point, I've seen the debate play out firsthand around employing consultants, and I think this is where it's good for the debates to be maturing, because there is a very knee-jerk tendency to go, well, all you need is a bunch of PAS-rated bollards, and that's it. So why do you need to employ a consultant? And I've been asked that a number of times, and sometimes it's the right thing, sometimes it isn't. Until the debate moves into the mature area of landscape architects taking it on and offering alternatives to bollards, that's the position that we're in. With people who hold purse strings, say, well, just leave it do that, why do you need to employ somebody? So we want that debate to move on. That will create room, but it's a bit of chicken and egg.
Back corner.
Yeah, Mark Chappell again. I mean, we've been focused throughout the day, and I guess the Sabre standard is focused on countering terrorism. From the private sector point of view, and all right, I did 30 years in government before I got here, you know, I'm going in to help businesses understand their business continuity issues and what their challenges are, which in some cases could be more real to them than countering terrorism. You know, so business continuity is one area. Insider threat is another area. You know, the part of defence I come from, you know, they spent 40 or 50 years talking about the insider threat to the level that we now talk about countering terrorism now. For businesses out there, insider threat, some of them will see the insider threat as a greater risk than countering terrorism. And then it crosses over at Heathrow, where you've got insiders who are promoting, you know, working on behalf of a terrorist organisation. So, you know, I would counsel that the private security consultant might bring a broader view of the world as well.
I'd echo that. I mean, Sabre is a security risk management standard and doesn't focus on any particular threat type. The reason we're talking about terrorism primarily here is that's what the planning system talks about. You know, if you read that MPPF, that's not talking about insider threat. That's not talking about, you know, sabotage or other risks to businesses. And that may be an answer to the earlier question about who owns the risk. A corporation, an organisation, has to look at holistically at all the risks it faces, not just in, you know, in the kind of the security sphere. Also, let's look at natural hazards and everything else. So, why should we have a situation where we're fracturing security and saying certain bits are paid for by the local authority, which is the terrorism bit, because that's what government policy says, but then what we pick up the cost for the other bits that are of concern to us. So yeah, it makes sense for the owner to pay just for that very reason. I'm going to go on to the very last question because I'm conscious of time. Let me just quickly move on. We've kind of covered the incentivisation. Oh, where was it? No, I've lost that question. This kind of, I think, has been answered. So should there be an expectation to receive advice from the police? So free advice. So Jenny, I'll just go along the table. Jenny?
I mean, I think actually that is something that we already offer when you come to the high risk. But as I say, it's the what is defined as that high risk. We will we actively engage routinely with those locations that are sitting at that high risk end. Certainly, there is protective security improvement programs that we will offer out. I think the thing is with crowded places locations, this is about the appetite of the site itself. We can offer that service, it doesn't have to be accepted from us, but I don't think I've ever come across a location that has rejected that service from the police. But certainly that continues to be our bread and butter at this moment in time as police counter-terrorism security advisors, but it is at this moment in time very much focused on those higher end, high risk sites, and this is where we're having to look and see actually what that service delivery looks like for those that sit under that lower tier, because we have to have a threshold set somewhere, purely for capacity issues.
Paul, I'll slightly rephrase this for you. If you were reviewing what you consider to be a high-risk site and you put a request out to the police to actually contribute, would you expect them to be willing?
I would hope so. It's where I will be going for the conversation on the bigger schemes that I referred to earlier. I think the challenge will be the capacity one. Simply as probably everybody in the room's awareness has grown, certainly mine has recently, and if part of this is a catalyst to go and raise the awareness further, there will be an awful lot of calls from local authorities to the police to try and assist with this quite quickly.
I think I've certainly, whenever I've been employed on a high-risk project, although we haven't really agreed between us what that means today, I've never had a problem getting CTSA support. Where I've seen an issue in the last couple of years is the lower risk projects, where we want design and out crime officer support, and they're very thin on the ground. So I would say high-risk projects, no issues, but I think there's potentially a capacity issue around the crime rather than the terrorism stuff.
John?
Yes, absolutely, they should expect it. I mean, assuming that they know that it's there. And I think, obviously, with the recent wave of attacks, then I think people are more familiar with that. If you went back 10 years ago, the number of times that I would go to a big shopping centre and speak to somebody and they were saying, yeah, we're paying this consultant this amount of money to do this. And I'd mention CTSAs and they had no idea what I was talking about. But I think that's changed now, of course.
Alistair, would your force be able to facilitate that in terms of resources?
I'd like to think that they would, but for me, it's that phrase high risk, you know, and it's looking at where the cut-off is, and obviously that's subjective. It's open to interpretation, and I think for me, it's making sure that the processes are in place, the procedures are in place to capture those developments when they're coming through. And having done the research around the country, I'm not convinced really that we're there yet, to be perfectly honest with you, in terms of having them there, because in some areas, it's on the agenda for everybody, everybody's thinking about it, other areas they're not so doing much. And I think for me, they've got to make sure that, from the local authorities, it's consistent, local authorities, the architect practices, your security consultants, and the developer as well, they're able to go to the police for that advice. They know it's there, and really it's raising that awareness and getting it out there to people to highlight what is actually available for them, the advice, and then obviously they'll have to deem it being if it's an appropriate project to become involved with, or give one certain level of advice and an interaction they feel is necessary.
Great. Right. Thank you very much to the panel. If everybody could show their appreciation.